Did you notice that I instantly became 10 years older? It was 30 years, not 40, thank you. Okay, okay. I'm starting to feel not only cranky, but creaky at that point. Okay. Thank you all for joining us. I guess this is the group in New Orleans that's already chosen its costumes for tomorrow. Okay. Now, one of our staff members sent me an email. He says, I need to take tomorrow afternoon off to prepare to be a vampire. I said, you need the afternoon? Just come down here. One of us will bite you. Okay. You know, we'll take care of that overnight. New Orleans, you know, New York, where I, well, allegedly grew up, it calls itself the melting pot. And when I was in 3rd grade, that made a lot of sense until some point later in my life, I realized, what the hell is a melting pot? Okay, I mean, I realized I have no idea what that term means. In Louisiana, of course, and particularly in New Orleans, we use as the metaphor what for our culture is a much more appropriate one, of course, and that is that of a gumbo. And you know, all the constituent groups that have combined to create the cultural identity of this remarkable and truly unique city, very, very distinctly different from many other cities across the United States. As Brian had said, this series on the arrivals you know, is our effort to come to understand how we came to be and who we are. Now, I'm just curious, as a rough measure, okay, if you are native born, okay, and let's not get into the birther thing, okay, and you know, we're not going to discuss Ted Cruz, okay, but if you were born within the confines of the state of Louisiana, okay, not in Afghanistan when your parents were serving, but within the borders of Louisiana, would you please raise your hands? Higher. Okay, interesting. And put those down. And if you were not, would you please raise your hand? Okay. All right. Allison Plyer is right. The demographics are changing. Louisiana actually leads the nation of all the states in the percentage of native-born population. It's about 81%. Pennsylvania, where I was born, kind of screwing up the statistics of both states, is actually second at 79 or 80%. There are towns in Louisiana, like Vacherie, where the native-born population is 93%. Okay. There's a reason why they call each other cousin, okay? Okay. We wrapped up the preliminary conversation on this subject of the arrivals a couple of weeks ago, around the time of the Haitian migration to New Orleans early in the 19th century, prompted by the Haitian Revolution. And we just sort of tailed off there. We thought as a good segue, Richard and Laura and I, I'll introduce you guys, to that would be to pick up that narrative thread and then we'll push it forward. Other than myself, we kind of have a two-lane scrum up here this evening.
A New York one.
And a New York.
And a New York one. Are we? Okay. Well, so it goes. I stayed here even after the warrants expired there. Okay. Laura teaches in the Tulane History Department. Her particular areas of expertise, though there are more than that, are Native American studies and Irish studies and Irish history. She has been one of our principal section editors for our digital encyclopedia, NOLA, on those two topics. In fact, she wrote the Irish entry. Richard Campanella, who's the other person up here besides me and Laura, is a geographer. It's the most, I don't know, it always throws me with that. He's a compendium of all knowledge pertaining to New Orleans and the area, the geography, the demographics, the history, Abraham Lincoln.
Bienville.
And not the vampire, the other one. Okay. Bourbon Street, and because he rides a bicycle, every pothole between Bywater and Uptown. Okay, he owns it. Richard is also the only person to twice win the Humanities Book of the Year award from the Louisiana Endowment for the Humanities. And Brian had mentioned that Richard is writing a column for us. I did want to insert one thing, though, because Richard and I, in talking about it, because he has done so much work on history, I told him that I wanted him to take on a slightly different take on it, and I wanted him to be our futurist. And so the thrust of his column for us is actually the past as prologue. And he is trying to look not so much backwards and explain to us, which he will be doing tonight, but in his column for us, looking forward, so we can have some sense of where we're going, which would be nice to know here. So without further ado, Richard was going to pick up that narrative thread a little bit at the end of the Haitian Revolution and the defeat of Leclerc's army of 60,000 by Toussaint Louverture during the Haitian Revolution.
Right. Yeah, thank you. What an exciting time in the history of the Western Hemisphere, the turn of the 19th century, the age of revolution. And the Haitian Revolution in particular plays a critical role in so many ways in setting the table for New Orleans' incredibly exciting and tumultuous 19th century, and immigration is a major part of that. So with from the French perspective, the loss of Saint-Domingue, Napoleon loses interest in his recently regained Louisiana colony and is increasingly willing to unload it to the Americans, who eagerly buy it. And suddenly this city, this transshipment port that is desperately needed by Americans as they're moving into those recently acquired British colonies down the Ohio River, they need a southern port for transshipment, so New Orleans becomes much more valuable. And at the very tail end, 5 years after the beginning of the independent nation of Haiti, 9,000 refugees arrive via Cuba. They are told to leave. They arrive here for the Francophone Creole society here. It more than doubles the population. 8,000 is the population at the time of the Louisiana Purchase, and by the 1810 census, which is really the first American census in here. Previous, it was Louisiana. It was a colony. The population is over 17,000. So let me just briefly, from 50,000 feet, paint a picture of what happens over the next 120 years in terms of immigration. So there. American migrants from the Northeast, mostly Anglo-Americans, start to arrive not so much in the opening years of the Louisiana Purchase, but during the 18-teens, and particularly after the Battle of New Orleans, which is kind of New Orleans coming out to the rest of the nation. On top of this group, you have the beginning of Irish and German and a multitude of smaller groups from the Mediterranean world, from Latin Europe, from Northern Europe. And the two major groups during the heart of the antebellum, by far, is Irish and German, the exact same two groups that dominate immigration to the Northeast. So while there is a certain level of exceptionalism here, there's also patterns that really you're seeing echoes and emulations and smaller forms of what you're also seeing in northeastern cities. So Irish and German peaking in the 1830s, 40s, 50s, particularly the 1850s. So I'm doing an air graph here. So we're going
with a hand puppet. Look at this.
Yeah.
We're going in time in this direction. So imagine these peaks of in the multiple thousands per year. 550,000 immigrants arrive through New Orleans between 1820 and 1860. 300,000 just in the 1850s. Irish and German up here. But then you have a multitude of smaller groups, and they're smaller in absolute numbers, but they're still significant. As we dim our cell phones, please. And they are Italian, mostly from the peninsula, not necessarily Sicily, as we see later. French, directly from France, the so-called foreign French. Spanish, the foreign French as opposed to Creole French. Cuban, Mexican, English, groups you may not expect. Civil War, everything changes. After the Civil War, we see much lower curves, probably about 1/5 of the size of the peak ones in the antebellum era. However, the data, it's very hard to get these numbers. Some of them come from shipping manifests and others from census. If it's census, they're living here. If it's a shipping manifest, they might have disembarked here, but they may well have moved on, and many Germans in particular up to Arkansas. After the Civil War, we have better census data, and so the numbers we have, while the curves are smaller, they actually stayed here. So these are Chinese at the very beginning after the war, then larger numbers of Sicilians, which we'll talk about, and then Slavs, mostly Southern Europe and Eastern Europe. And this, again, emulates what you see to the larger northeastern cities.
Let me just interject on that for a second, though, because one pattern that I was noticing, Richard, looking at the data, it's very dramatic to say that by 1810 the population doubled, bringing the city, as you said, to 17,000, give or take, but changing the racial cast of it in utterly dramatic ways, because at that point the city was majority African American because of this influx from Haiti between slaves and free people of color who came in. But that doubling to 1810 is beggared by the jump from 1820 to 1840. And in 1840, New Orleans is the third largest city in the United States. That's the highest it ever reaches in relation to other parts of the country. The population, Richard, I'm sure you know, from 1820 to 1840 quadrupled. Okay? It went from 27,000 to 102,000. I think it's actually the largest jump of any 20-year period in Louisiana's history. What accounts in that 20-year period for such a dramatic increase? We don't have a precipitating event like the Haitian Revolution.
Well, in a significant portion of that is the initial waves of the Irish and German, and it is a majority black city up until that point. And Irish and German converted to a majority white city, it maintains that proportion into the late 1970s. So, the population is roughly doubling every 15 years during the antebellum era, which is just really exceptional, and a multitude of reasons. But for many of those folks, particularly the Northeasterners coming down, it was a sense that this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to get in on something big as it's happening. And there's this great 19th century phrase called on the make, that they were down here on the make, seizing this opportunity, the southwestern frontier, just as you have all these Americans pouring down, you have these populations, and what proved to be the richest valley on earth is under cultivation. And we should not forget that another element coming in here is forced, and that is about 750,000 slaves from the old northern South that were being sent down into this new Western market and transshipped into the New Orleans slave market, and they are also arriving down here.
And economically, because I just want to understand this, one of the things that often irritates me when we study history, and we had a really phenomenal antidote to the kind of miasmal confusion that is so rampant when people talk about New Orleans. David Johnson was moderating the panel last time, and Larry Powell, another Tulane professor, was on that panel. Larry, in his book, The Accidental City, explicates the actual social, political, and economic mechanism by which the caste of people called free people of color come into being, why it actually happens, instead of just waving a magic wand and saying, oh yeah, French, Spanish, African, Shazam, okay, as if that suddenly explained everything. It was actually clear. What I'm curious about, Richard, Louisiana was the poorest of the French colonies. David quoted me last time when I had pointed out that prisoners in the Bastille, when offered freedom in exchange for being colonists in Louisiana, rioted. Okay, it was the original It was well, the mortality rate was 80%, okay? So it was the original hell no, we won't go. But how does Louisiana become transformed? What are the forces underlying it from that transform it from being the poorest of all of the colonies in the French Empire to a place where the population, or it becomes the third largest city on the American continent? Well,
The major transshipment point for vast quantities of two major commodities, and that is cotton and sugar. It so happens, now remember, with Saint-Domingue in flames for 12 years and then a new nation launching, that had been the world's number one sugar producer. Now that's gone. And at the very same time, you have all these new sugar plantations down here that are filling in that market. And so the lower part of the Alluvial Valley is now booming under cotton plantations. So, New Orleans becomes a center of finance. With regard to the free people of color population, what oftentimes gets forgotten is that there is increasing pressure to do away with this population as the antebellum era goes on. That population actually, it's very stable. There's a little quirk in some of the census data. I used the word compendium earlier, the compendium volumes, where I think it's in the 1830 or 1840 census where someone actually went through the population schedules and summed up the numbers and then put them in the compendium volume. And it looks like the free people of color population went from about 10,000 to 20,000, but then it's back down to about 10,000 the next year. And I think that's an error. You see it embedded in a number of other secondary sources. But there was pressure to eliminate the rights of the free people of color. And Lincoln actually played a role in that in the late 1850s.
Either that or it was a very early manifestation of the Tea Party. And the voter rolls were being stricken. Laura, I think this is a good point to segue to, yeah, you laugh. Good point to segue over to what I think is the largest immigrant group that is informing this dramatic change and increase in the population.
Certainly in the antebellum period. So for reasons that Richard was just speaking about, and what I have to constantly remind my students is that New Orleans is this, it's this boom town. Everybody sees it as this great economic opportunity or on the make, reason to come here. And it's not the city that care forgot. And I think you've got to keep that mindset there. So that's why the Irish come. That's why so many different immigrant groups come. And the Irish come earlier during the Spanish period. They come as Irish priests. Of course, we have Alejandro O'Reilly, Bloody O'Reilly. But they're coming either as individuals or priests that come in. And we get some refugees from the 1798 political exiles that come here that are a better educated group who are Republican in values. But really, and we get some more in the 1820s and 1830s in reaction to the end of the Napoleonic Wars, famine in Ireland, many famines happening in Ireland. But really, the major bulk is going to come in the late 1840s and 1850s, the same way that they're coming to the rest of the United States. And New Orleans is not only the third largest city, it's the second largest port in America. And this is the age of steam. It's the age of sail, and we don't have railroads. We haven't entered that age yet. That comes, the Transcontinental Railroad is built in 1865. So not only does the Civil War stop and kind of get this arrested development here, but the railroad going east to west has a dramatic effect on the economy down here. So there are all kinds of different factors that make for an Irish immigrant population to come to a trickle. It doesn't come to a stop after the Civil War, but it certainly comes to a trickle. And this is where Irish New Orleans deviates from the rest of the United States. 1850, per capita, our Irish population was larger than Boston. It was larger than Philadelphia. And, you ask people now, or ask my students who come from back east, and they go, Irish New Orleans? There were Irish here? And they're coming from Boston with last names like Murphy or Kelley. And I'm like, yeah. But what happened back east, which doesn't happen down here, is that those Irish immigrants continued to go to the cities in the Northeast or to Chicago or out to San Francisco following the railroad lines. But what I find striking here, and something that my students and I focus on, is why do we still have an Irish identity? When really, for a large part, given the 19th century into the 20th, it should have disappeared. You know, we don't have that necessary fresh immigrant blood that adds to it, that reinforces it, that maintains it. And so one of the questions I ask them is, you know, how is identity formed? How is ethnic identity formed? What are the components of it? And also, how is it maintained? So looking at those questions back to the antebellum period, one of the criteria that we look at and consider are specific organizations that are formed, ethnic organizations, celebrations of civic or religious holidays, and or, you know, churches being built. And so thinking about that with the Irish, you may find it surprising that the first St. Patrick's Day parade was celebrated in 1809. So that tells us that even though we're getting these refugees in and they're coming in small numbers, and a lot of them are these merchants that are coming in seeking that economic opportunity and not this massive wave, that that they still sought each other out and they're forming ethnic identity. Organizations, we have a lot of charitable organizations with, you know, things like St. Patrick always thrown in the title. Militias, which were quite common back then, and different groups formed them, from free men of color to the Anglo-Americans, who are also an immigrant group. We have to remember that. The Anglo-Americans are not our base group. They're another outsider coming into the city. The Irish formed their own militia group called the Republican Greens, which tells you right then, you know, in 1813, it tells you their mindset. They're not the United Irishmen, they're the Republican Greens. So they're fighting for this independent Ireland. And then the church. We get the church a little bit later in the 1830s, with the first one being St. Patrick, you know, the first church outside of St. Louis Cathedral, and speaking to an Irish population.
That's the one here in the CBD?
That's the one here in the CBD, yeah, on Camp Street. So first a wooden church, 1833, 34, and then Gallier comes in and it gets finished in the early 1840s. So when the famine immigrants arrive in the 1840s, late 1840s, 1850s, there's a foundation here. And the question is, with that foundation, is how much of a connection is there between this older, more established Irish group, or some people like to call them the, you know, the lace Irish, and the famine immigrants that are coming in in huge numbers. And so similar to the Haitians coming in with that 9,000 that arrive in a year, in the city, the Irish come in a huge number in a very short period of time. And
what's that time frame?
That time frame is going to be like our late 1840s into our early 1850s.
Not that late, okay.
Yeah. So the potato famine, the reason why they had to leave Ireland, the first famine was in 1845. So to give you a little sense of how dramatic this was for Ireland, 1845, the population of Ireland was 8.5 million people. Within 10 years, they're going to lose 2 million to immigration, and they're going to lose over 1 million to death. So that dropped it down. The population of the entire island, so including the north and the south, will remain at about 4.3 to 4.5 million until the 1990s. It is still at 6.5 million. They never regained that population loss. Yeah.
Ask you to elaborate on just two
Sure.
aspects of that. So actually, that bulk of the Irish immigration doesn't contribute to that quadrupling between 1820 and 1840. It's actually after that period?
No, they do come in. They come in most famously or infamously with building the New Basin Canal. Now, this is where we get into squishy numbers, very squishy numbers. We don't know how many came. We don't know how many died. I've got actually one student who is doing her master's on it right now, trying to get to the bottom of the New Basin Canal and how many people actually died, how many people worked on it.
The myth is 20,000.
The myth is 20,000. For some reason, 8,000 seems people have settled upon. Others will feel reasonable saying 3,000. I've had people tell me 30,000 or 40,000. And not wanting to get into this is a very emotional issue for the natives here, and sometimes my more dispassionate historian view has a tendency to set some tempers afire. But the population in 1830 is about 46,000. The population in 1840 is just over 100,000, so it nearly doubled. So it's what Richard's saying it's doing.
Germans as well.
And we're getting a lot of Germans in as well. We're getting other groups in well. We're getting those Anglo-Americans coming in, and all kinds of things are happening. The canal took 6 years to build. It's 3.17 miles long. And what we're trying to figure out is, in reality, how many people it would take to build it. And we can't, and what would be a reasonable mortality rate.
And why were Irish laborers employed rather than slaves?
Oh.
Slow pitch.
Yeah. So, Olmsted, thank you. He has had one quote that is quoted by everybody. And he was even in Louisiana when he made that comment about using Irish workers instead of slaves. He was in Virginia. And it wasn't about canal work. It was about clearing a field. I think a couple of things need to be put in perspective. And one, the Irish were working on canals everywhere. And they were working canals from the Erie across Ohio. This is the era of the Great Canal building. Anything to get you closer to the Mississippi and then down the way. So they're following these. And one thing you know when you get to the 1850 census, because the 1850 census is the first time that they have the entire household listed, not just head of household and when saying, yeah, I've got 5 other people living here, that you can follow a lot of these Irish families. And you follow them, thank you, because they have large families, and you see where their children are born. So I see them born, couple in Ireland, then New York, then I've got Ohio, Kentucky, Louisiana. I'm like, I've just plotted where you've been. So they're doing that work anyways. And they're following work routes that are going on.
And is that the push and pull? That the push is the famine, right? The lack of opportunity, the lack of food in Ireland, and the pull is the opportunity of this employment in the United States. Is that right?
Yeah, in general, the opportunity is here. And then another pull factor to New Orleans specifically would be the fact that all the ships of the day are going to Liverpool full with cotton, and then they're empty. And so Irish immigrants, or the Irish, have to get across Ireland from Dublin to Liverpool, but then they've got passage. And the passage from Liverpool to New York or Liverpool to New Orleans was the same fare.
Wait, they were ballast? Okay.
They were ballast, but
had to pay for the return journey.
They were on the return journey. Yes, this was a repositioning cruise of a different era.
And so let's now connect those dots a bit as you had just started to do. So paralleling the arrival of the Irish, talk a little bit about the Germans. And by the way, this building, Turner's Hall, was built in 1868 by the Society of Turners. The Germans very much here it was the Turgamide Society. In New York, it was the Turnverein. In Chicago, I believe, was the Turnverein also. The Germans very much believed in physical culture. The turning apparently referred to gymnastics. The first 2 floors of this building were a large gymnasium originally, actually. And then what is now the 3rd floor, and that was actually the last floor, though there now appear to be, there are 2 others above it now, was a large ballroom. And it was built by German Immigrant Society for as a convening place for that community. So if you wouldn't mind talking a bit about the advent of the Germans.
Remarkably parallel in many ways to the Irish. They come in at roughly the same time, not quite in the same numbers, but close to them. The 1850 census, as Laura was saying, is valuable for a number of reasons. The other one is that it's the first to list birthplace. And so you don't have to come up with these methodologies of guessing surnames and Kelley and is such and such a surname Anglo-Saxon or German or and so the 1850 census, we have 20,000 Irish and 11,000 German. Those are the two. Now these that have settled here, born elsewhere, born in those places. They are now they're significantly better educated and more likely to be skilled and or professional. So they do have that advantage. Many of these were the 48ers who escaped during the turmoil of 1848.
Explain what that is.
The German liberals of the 1848 was a almost like a 1968 event of
year of revolution.
A year of revolution of a democratic, a yearning to do away with the monarchies and establish democratic governments, and so many left upon with this turmoil, and the so-called German liberals. You'll hear that term. So many arrived here, and it's this is during the era where it's increasingly you're able to get into the interior without going through New Orleans on account of the Erie Canal and railroads. So, so in this era, they are coming through New Orleans. Many move on. Those that settle here, they have the advantage of their professions, but they have the disadvantage of language. And so that puts them in a fairly parallel social situation with the Irish. And what's really interesting as a geographer rather than a pure historian is to look at their residential settlement patterns. And they're pretty close to identical. We talk about the Irish Channel today, but it was as much German. And so the settlement patterns for both these groups, as well as most of the antebellum immigrants, were instead of the inner city, they settled in this kind of a band at the extreme urban periphery. And the urban periphery at that time would have been the riverine Irish Channel, right where the city petered out, a little past Felicity Street, Toledano, into halfway through Uptown, coming around Dryads, the back of town, New Basin Canal, rear of Tremé, into the 3rd District, what we now have revived names of Marigny and St. Roch, into Little Saxony. And so why in these areas? First of all, you had low density, fairly low value real estate where you could settle into it. Because of the lower density, you had market gardening and truck farming opportunities where you could raise your own gardens right in the back. Any surplus, which is known as truck. I used to think it meant the little vehicle that you took to the market, but truck means surplus produce. And so you can make some money by selling that at the municipal markets. And that was municipal markets were a major driver of ethnic settlement patterns. But most of all, this suburban periphery. Remember, the suburbs in those era were kind of like the suburbs of European cities. It's not the place you wanted to live. You wanted to live in the inner core. That's where the wealthy lived. And so the geography of antebellum American cities was the reverse of the late 1900s geography, where inner city means poor. And so this is where the hard labor, low-skill employment was. This is where the flatboat wharves were, the rope walks, the tanneries, the boiling of animal bones, the rendering, all these smelly, stinking, high-maintenance, high-labor activities that needed to be close enough to the city because that's where they sold their produce, but couldn't be too close because of the nuisances and because of their big footprints. So they settled at that periphery, and that's where that immigrant groups employment. So where the Irish settled was roughly where the Germans settled.
I'll just add something to that to help you kind of visualize this, because you have to imagine this is a walking city. This is the era, it's a walking city. And so where you work, where you live, all these things have to be within a reasonable walking distance from each other. And And so when Richard's talking about all these different occupations, you're also living near them. You're not living there and walking 12 blocks to get to them. And you're following the river because, again, remember, the river is our mainstay. It's our economic engine. And so you follow these along the river or towards the back of town with the New Basin Canal connecting Lake Pontchartrain, again, a waterway. But if you want to get a really good idea of where they live, because, you know, we've exploded in our population since then, you look to where the churches are. That's one of the easiest ways to find out where an immigrant group is. And so with the Irish, we've got St. Patrick's, obviously, right here, and then St. Teresa's, which is where the statue of Margaret is, another Irish immigrant woman, and then we go St. Alphonsus. You can actually stand on top of the Ogden, and you can see St. John the Baptist, St. Alphonsus, St. Patrick, and St. Teresa, and like, you know, bird's eye view. It's wonderful. And tying in to what Richard was saying about this parallel development with the German and the Irish is the fact that in the heart of the Irish Channel, with the St. Alphonsus Church, is directly across from it is the German church, St. Mary's. Of course, they don't face each other. That's the other funny thing. You know, talk about ethnic rivalry. You know, they're like this. Haven't been there like this. But my students never believe me until we go out and see them that they really are right across the street from each other.
Bit odd. This is the 1,000 block of Constance.
Right. This is 2 blocks off of Jackson, 1 block below Magazine Street. And again, you're not far from the river, and you're going to have that combination of residential work, and then your school, your church, your whole community is right there.
Let me ask about another pattern here. As we said earlier, New Orleans in 1840 reached its pinnacle as the 3rd largest city in the United States. It gradually, over succeeding census, began to decline. 1860, it's 6th in the country. 1870, it's 9th. 1880 is the last time it's in the top 10. It's 10th. At that point, it's a population of 216,000. By 1900, it's dropped to 12th place. Now, one thing I'm curious about, because you mentioned the railroads, how this is a port city, and the development of railroads in the mid part of the century, especially following the Civil War. One of the main economic drivers in the development of the United States and the fulfillment of Manifest Destiny was the incentive created for the railroads to populate the areas along the right-of-way. The railroads were basically seeded, I believe it was a mile on either side of the right-of-way, in some places 2 miles on either side of the right-of-way, in exchange for them building the transcontinental railroads, and there were several of them. Union Pacific was the first. That land had no value unless it was populated. And so the railroads had an inherent incentive to populate and to encourage immigration to the United States. So my question is, and I'm just wondering, is it possible that one of the reasons that New Orleans' relative position in population to the rest of the United States as it grows and expands is because the railroads weren't that central here, and they would not have been the driving engine of encouraging European populations to immigrate, to farm, to develop communities, as well as to exploit other natural resources like the Iron Range in Michigan, for example, or in Colorado. Is that possibly why we start to recede from being the 3rd largest city in the United States?
I would note that peak happened. Many people presume that it was the Civil War that reversed that ascent, but as Michael pointed out, it's actually 20 years before that we peaked and started falling behind other cities. And I would say that the main driving, and I might be a little bit predisposed here as a geographer, that the main driving variables were not just the Erie Canal, but a number of other canals, the Illinois and Michigan, another one that opened up getting around the Great Falls of the Ohio, as well as railroads that gave Western farmers and other options of getting their commodities to market.
Besides the Mississippi
Besides
River.
the Mississippi. In the early days, if you plot out the tonnage coming out of the West in the 1810, 1820, before the Erie Canal, New Orleans got 99 to 100% of that. If you're wondering about that 1%, believe it or not, it went out the Great Lakes, each of the Great Lakes, up the St. Lawrence and all the way around. It was like this percent. So New Orleans got almost 100%. Once you pass that Canal Railroad era of the 1830s, 1820s, 30s, 40s, by 1860, it's 50%. So the city did not, and this was New Orleans' critical mistake. The pie kept growing. So the commercial class did not realize it. Why plan on a rainy day when you're doing so well right now? They didn't realize that their slice of the pie was diminishing. And so they failed to seize that opportunity to diversify the economy, to build industry, to build factories of, instead of shipping the lint to Liverpool and have the English turn it into a shirt, we do that here in the value added. So that opportunity was missed. It was almost an over-reliance on the Mississippi, and canals and railroads undercut that.
And at the same time, because this has always struck me, we had the opportunity as the port, right, to be also a point of manufacture. And instead, we've never capitalized that. In my travels around the state, one of the lectures that I used to give was when I go to, especially to small communities around the state, the lecture began with the idea, why are we here? Okay, not the Sunday morning, why are we here? Okay, or it's corollary, why are those other people here? Okay, you know, if we're Lutherans, they're Methodists, why are they here? I mean, we're here. But it's always fascinated me why communities form where they form. Sometimes for completely mysterious reasons. Take Atlanta, for example. Okay, all right. No, seriously, there's no particular geography. No, I know, but that's artificial. No, no, it is, but it's not a reason like that's what I'm trying to say. Thank you. Okay, we did not rehearse this, as you can tell. Okay.
You have 3 New Yorkers.
Yeah, we'd rather be right than polite. Okay. But the serious difference, New Orleans has a natural geographic advantage at the mouth of the Mississippi River. As you said, 99% of the shipping coming down, and therefore dominates as a port. Atlanta really is an interesting phenomenon because it's nothing prior to the Civil War to speak of, despite Gone with the Wind. You know, it's a railroad crossing, and that the importance of that positioning in a man-made transportation system, you know, is exactly why it is today. And then, of course, they added the airport, okay, at a point in which another transportation system becomes crucial. So New Orleans doesn't, though. I mean, is that what you were indicating in your comments, that we were kind of comfortable with the natural advantage that we came to enjoy, and did not see those changes occurring across the landscape?
And a part of this was that there were still more and more commodities coming down here. So the shipping community was busier than ever. The cotton factories, the sugar factories were busier than ever. But a larger portion of that was going elsewhere. I would also point out that the fact that commodities could now go from the west to the east through the Great Lakes, through the Erie Canal, down the Hudson River to New York, Philadelphia, and the northeastern cities, faster, better, cheaper, it made basic foodstuffs cheaper in the Northeast. So that opened up disposable income that people could spend on other things. So this motivated people to create other things for them, and so it helped stoke industry and factories, and so the North increasingly industrialized and pulled away from the increasingly agrarian South, and you start to lay the groundwork for, you know, what comes out of those.
I want to make sure we get to at least 2 other things, because we're supposed to wrap up the 19th century this evening. First is, let's make sure we talk about the Italians and Sicilians and their role as the other major immigrant group. Would one of you want to speak a bit to that?
Yeah, I can speak to that. Richard and I will play tag team on that. So the Italians follow, like many of our immigrant groups, they didn't just all of a sudden appear in 1890. We have Italians that have come as early as with La Salle to, so our pre-colonial period to our French colonial period, through the Spanish and into the early American period. But they're coming as, again, individual small numbers, but they are coming here, and they're coming here for the same reason that others are, because of economic opportunity. We see in the antebellum period enough of an Italian community starting to form, especially about the 1840s or so. But they're from more of like what we would call northern Italy. So the Germans and the Italians have two things in common, that they're coming from countries that aren't countries. Germany isn't a country and Italy isn't a country then. It's made up of lots of, smaller kingdoms and things like that. And I emphasize that point because it means that we have a lot of different identities, and we shouldn't lump them all together as Italians when they're not going to see themselves all together as Italians. And certainly if you ask a Bavarian today, he will tell you he's not German, he'll say he's Bavarian, so there's a lot to be said about that. But they're coming from more like from northern Italy, and they are forming businesses here, and we get our first sort of benevolent societies and other things forming. So some of that criteria that we look at to see, is there an Italian identity? The reason why we associate Italians with New Orleans are due to not Italians, but Sicilians coming in later. And it's also one of the unintended consequences of the Civil War. They're being recruited. We've got, agricultural, we need labor, and the Louisiana state government, in conjunction with businesses, picks up this idea about recruiting labor and what they think will be good, efficient labor. And so our Sicilians are coming in, and they also were different from other immigrant groups because certainly for a period of time, Sicilian men are coming in and going back, coming in and going back. That's really unusual. The Irish, it's a one-way trip. You're coming, and then you're instituting chain migration, and you're bringing over your family. And while you may keep a strong connection with Ireland, you are not moving back to Ireland. You are staying here. So the Italians were different in that respect. But really, they close out our 19th century and are important for the food and the business and the fruit trade, and they change the nature of, well, they don't change the nature. They add another layer to the French Quarter where they settle. And, Richard has done that work on looking at, okay, why settle here? Where are you settling in and around the city? And again, it ties into the fruit trade that they're bringing in, selling produce, getting involved with that. And as we all see at the lower end of Decatur, we still see, a strong presence of that Sicilian immigrant group. So
well,
I'm add to that.
I'm going to give a prequel to that,
give
if you
prequel,
will.
yes.
1865, end of the Civil War. From the perspective of one of Louisiana's biggest industries, the sugarcane industry, they are in an unprecedented state. From their perspective, they lost their labor force. Yeah. And so what they do is they look to their peers in the Caribbean to see what emancipation swept through the Caribbean about a generation earlier, to see what they did. And what many of the planters there in Cuba and elsewhere did was they looked to South Asia and they looked to East Asia. And they recruited tens of thousands of the term they used at the time, coolies. And this explains why there's a Chinatown in Havana and why you have a large South Asian Indian population in Trinidad. And so the Louisiana planters took up that approach and recruited Chinese out of Cuba starting in 1867. And that lasted for about a year or two. A couple hundred arrived here. That petered out. There was a war broke out in Cuba. That supply line ended. They then replaced them with Chinese out of California, and about 1,000 arrived. then on the heels of that, actually recruited directly out of Hong Kong. And the U.S. government was very, very suspicious about it. They thought it was a backhanded way of reestablishing some form of servitude and slavery. And in some ways, except the most literal sense, it kind of was. So the Chinese, there were about 1,200 or so. It did not work out on the sugarcane plantations, and they urbanized within a couple of years. And they arrived to a New Orleans that was very different from that antebellum structure that we talked about earlier, where the wealthy lived in the inner city and the poor immigrants lived in the periphery. Now things were changing. Streetcar systems were in place. The wealthier were moving out to those areas that used to be poor. Uptown starts to develop, and tenement sort of housing opportunities now start to exist in the places they vacated, such as the Lower French Quarter, and that's why that became Little Palermo. And then Chinatown existed starting in the 1870s, only a couple of blocks from over here, within a little bit band immediately surrounding the inner core. So when the Chinese didn't work...
Near Tulane and North Rampart, right?
Yes, exactly. 1100 block diagonally across from the library. So when the Chinese didn't work out, the sugar planters looked to Spanish. That didn't work out. Portuguese. They tried Scandinavians out of the Midwest. And then finally, they tried, starting in 1870...
They loved the weather.
They had some success with these Sicilians who were just coming out of unification. There's strife and starvation in Sicily, and because there's shipping lines from Palermo to New Orleans for the fruit trade, everything is in place, and so that explains. So, it doesn't quite align with our La America immigration narrative here, that these folks were actively recruited here, and they did indeed go back and forth.
Wow. I want to add one other kind of curious note that's often not discussed in this context of demographics and immigration, and coming at you maybe a little bit from left field. Brace yourself.
It's a real series.
You wouldn't know it for reading the papers. During the Civil War, a third of all white males in Louisiana served in the Confederate Army. 20% of them, were killed. Right? These are mostly the young men, the next generation, of course. Another 40% were wounded, and back then, being wounded was a fairly serious affair, and so they were probably, in many respects, debilitated. So, in other words, basically, one-fifth of one-third, 15%, of the male population of Louisiana died in that war. In today's numbers, just extrapolating that would be 345,000 men dead. Just to give you a perspective of the social impact of that war on the internal population is what I'm trying to speak to. Not just the new immigrants that come in, but what's happened to the people that were already here. 15% of them were killed. 40% of them were debilitated and wounded. In addition, New Orleans, having been the first major southern city to fall in 1862, it was under Union domination very early in the war. And during the immediate period of Reconstruction, it was already a sizable Yankee presence even before we got here. And of course, many of what were called carpetbaggers, and that, of course, was not meant as a compliment. Did you know that? Do you know any place where that's? Oh, yes, it's a source, not a source of praise. But I'm curious: was there a substantial reconfiguration internally of the domestic population? Did a lot of Northerners, in other words, as a result of the Civil War and Reconstruction, come down here, particularly given a bit of a vacuum that would have been created by the high mortality among the native population? Just a question.
I was actually no. You took a shot.
Okay. Well, I don't have a sense that the carpetbaggers who came down here represented a a demographically substantial number that you would see in macro level population statistics. And I would point out this, that it was between the 1860 and the 1870 census that for the first time in New Orleans history, the white population actually goes down.
During which years?
1860 to 1870. So the two censuses straddling the Civil War.
So does the literacy rate of the white population in that period. It's the only state in the country exactly in that decade when the literacy level of the white population declines. Only state in the country.
At the same time, the black population doubles from 25,000 to 50,000. And the increase, I mean, that's like 100, it's like 90, literally 98 to 100% increase. And the increases are not as steep in subsequent decades. So what you're seeing here is another major element of the immigration migration, and that is internal, emancipated slaves from the sugar parishes, from the Mississippi cotton counties, many of them Anglo-African American as opposed to Franco-African American, arriving to the hope of the city and turning their back on any further toil on the plantation. And so they arrive to this unwelcoming city.
That's what I was going to add to that I've been working on a project at St. Alphonsus Parish, the Catholic parish, and kind of extending beyond those boundaries, and we've been working up to now to 1930. And one of the surprising things is to see how quickly, between 1860 to 1870, that we start seeing African Americans from Alabama, Mississippi that are moved into our Irish Channel, and forming a church and all kinds of different things quite early on. And so in one neighborhood, you see what was happening, around the city. So I would say less the white migrant population is interesting, and the effect it has on the city, much more interesting as the African American one. And that's not Francophone. It doesn't have anything to do with that history or that heritage or that culture. It's its own immigrant group to speak of.
This Reconstruction and post-Reconstruction period is a terrifying period in Louisiana history. The Bourbons were the old political power structure, and post-Reconstruction. They brought in Jim Crow laws with a vengeance. Okay, and as a result, even though with the Equal Rights Amendment, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments of the Constitution, following the Civil War, enfranchising and giving rights to African Americans, by 1898, okay, the Bourbons had managed to reduce the black voting rolls in Louisiana. And you thought I was kidding about the Tea Party earlier? They reduced the black voting rolls in Louisiana by 1898 from 130,000 to 5,320. Okay, and the viciousness of this group. Joe Gray Taylor wrote the first major history of Louisiana, and I recommend it to you. He's a remarkable. He passed away about 20 years ago. He's a remarkable progressive historian. And he says of the Bourbons that they would have eliminated, not only did they not want to see literacy for the freed slaves, but he said they would have eliminated public education for the whites if they thought they could have gotten away with it.
Can I interject there just for a second? One of the questions when teaching about ethnic New Orleans or even about antebellum New Orleans that we often wrestle with is, when does New Orleans become Americanized? A lot of times the focus of antebellum New Orleans is often the Creole versus American discussion, which is very valid and incredibly interesting. What happens in the city, and literally in geographic sense, with the city splitting up into three in 1836, to all kinds of other cultural, social questions. But the question is always, when does New Orleans become Americanized? And I've argued, and others have argued, that New Orleans becomes Americanized when we get, by the end of the 19th century, when we get that type of racism in full force, when we go from a city that was, with its three-caste system, with its free people of color and its slaves and its white, and a much more fluid race situation, to 100 years later, almost 100 years later, at the close of the 19th century, and we've become Southern, we've become American, and the world is very much divided into black and white, and that's when an argument goes that we've lost a large part of our distinctiveness, and made the full force into it. American.
Wow. I love talking with you guys. And now you get your chance. We would be delighted to, hopefully we've provoked you a little bit. We would like to throw it open to Q&A now. If you wouldn't mind coming forward, because we are diligently recording this. If you're in the Federal Witness Protection Program, you might not want to do this. But anybody else, please speak into the microphone and have at us.
I had to write this down because it's kind of complicated.
Oh, hold on, honey. Don't make it too long.
No, complicated for me.
All right.
It's for Richard. You talked about the mindset as it related to us preparing for the future, related to the railroads coming in and we didn't diversify and take advantage of it, whatever. Have we changed that mindset?
Well,
You know, a lawyer never asks a question he doesn't know the answer to.
I'm not a lawyer.
this was never a particularly industrialized city at all on account of that missed opportunity. But and I'm increasingly coming to realize that it was quite a bit more industrialized than one might presume. And this is one major credit to the immigrant groups, and particularly the postbellum ones, and that we had a fair amount of food processing industries here. We had, and the Germans, if you're having both beer and wine tonight, the French made this a wine town, but the Germans made it a beer town. And they formed a number of major breweries. There was one right on Bourbon Street. There was Jack's, there was Falstaff, there was Dixie. There were macaroni manufacturers in the lower French Quarter. There was food processing all over. There were furniture manufacturers. There was actually a Ford assembly plant. Did you know we used to assemble automobiles here in the 1920s, 30s, 40s? St. Bernard Parish, the building is still there. Now, they weren't literally manufactured here. The parts were manufactured, but because it was awkward to send completed vehicles all the way down here the way we do now, parts were shipped down and they were assembled here. So I've always thought that we have a lot more industrial capability here. We have the real estate. New Orleans East has all those sites. We have the waterborne access. But frankly, if industry ever does come back here, you know what? It's going to be robotics. It's probably not going to create jobs.
So the
Hold that for a future column.
A question for Dr. Kelley.
Yeah.
You didn't complete your thought on Olmsted.
Oh, sorry. I thought I bypassed that one. Caught. So the famous quote, or often quoted or misquoted or paraphrased, is that everybody preferred to use Irish laborers because slaves were too valuable. And there are several underlying themes that happen there. The Irish are worth less than slaves. Therefore, you can dispose of them. Therefore, they're considered less than slaves. So if we're putting everything on the great hierarchy, which they do in the 19th century, Irish are down here and slaves are above them.
But his point was, if I could just interject, his point was that there was a capital investment in slaves, whereas Irish were day laborers. And
they're day laborers. And that point is often not considered. When I see it used most and when I hear people, it's the number one thing I get when I'm like, what do? I study Irish immigrants and, Irish in New Orleans. And they're like, oh, yeah, they were worth less than slaves. And I'm like, okay, can we move beyond that? So it's a little frustrating from my point because people don't think about it. And they also somehow, oddly enough, get this sense that slaves are treated better. And let me tell you, slaves are not treated better in the 1830s. And I get that's usually the second sentence that comes out, that that they are treated better. So I get frustrated by that aspect and to it. And also to tie in, because it's that quote or paraphrase is often used in conjunction with the building of the New Basin Canal. And everybody says this, Irish are paid $1 a day. And $1 a day just doesn't sound like a lot to us. But again, step back in time, what is $1 a day then? Or if we use an Irish laborer in 1845, let's just remove the canal from the equation. You know, your laborer, he earns $1 a day. Well, if you go to eh.net, economic-historians.net, and the wonderful world of computers and math and all kinds of wonderful things, you can put in a number, put in the year, and put in the year you'd like to bring it up to, all the way up to 2012. They then give you about 20 different ways to interpret what $1 is, from purchasing power to income value to all kinds of different things. Because $1 isn't $1. Well, $1 worth of labor for this time period is roughly about $200 a day. Well, that's something entirely different when we move it up and we move it forward. The same way that our Sicilians, are getting paid their $1 or 80 cents or $1.10, that same fluctuating amount. Just keep things in perspective. That's just all that I asked. I'm not saying that they're living the life of luxury or the life of Riley, but definitely don't automatically equate one with today, because there is a huge difference.
Yes, ma'am.
Hey, I just, really, really curious about the number of Irish who died. And I wonder...
The second thing people bring up, yes.
Yeah, I wonder why the information is so sparse or so scarce. Why don't we have better numbers on that? I've heard some people say none of them died, or, just a few hundred died. And then, of course, we've heard the 12,000 or whatever.
The 20,000, because there's a nice little rhyming about these 20,000 mix.
It seems bizarre to me that we don't have any more concrete knowledge of that. Why is that?
Well, there's a couple of things that are going on with the canal. One, there's several things that we have to look into. I've had my students do numerous researches through newspaper articles. And because it took 6 years to build, this is a very small window that we're talking about. And with today's technology and with the recognition that computers can do, with newspapers that are scanned in, so you don't have to necessarily go through them, there are no articles. So unless we're all going to believe in conspiracy theories and nobody is willing to write about it, that alone sends off warning bells that we don't have, 2,000 Irish dying each year over a 6-year period. The few stories that do come up, and this is much more in line with what I find about the Irish in general, is that it's the fighting Irish. It's not the Irish walking like zombies and people stepping over the bodies and continuing to dig mindlessly, and going forward. No, we have 100 Irish that early on in the canal building that strike. That's like the first strike. And they strike because they don't like the conditions. They don't like the doctor. They don't like the food that's being served. And they strike. And there's this huge uproar about this. So which one is it? Is it the fighting Irish who weren't willing to put up with this, and the fighting Irish that also literally go around and fight, and we get factions from Kerrymen to Corkmen? Or is it the zombie Irish that somehow can be treated like brutes, work like brutes, never speak their mind, and fall dead, and we cover them with mud and they keep going? I've spoken to colleagues about this. There's somebody up in Madison who's doing a dissertation on it. And the most fascinating thing I found with him is he's looking at the canals that are being built, as Richard said, throughout the Ohio Valley and stuff, is that the same thing goes on there. There's the same, it's like this magical 20,000 Irish died digging this canal over this 5-year period, and he can find no evidence for it. He finds nothing. And we've looked at charity hospital records, we've looked at other things. And so when he found about New Orleans, he was fascinated that he's coming across this. So I think you've got a couple of things going on. I think the bigger question is a collective memory. what's going on. Things get exaggerated with time, but there's a collective memory. There's a psyche. There's a scar of issues that have gone on in Ireland. You compound it with something like a cholera epidemic, which does happen in New Orleans in 1832, and we do get thousands that die from that. You put them all together, and I think this kind of grows up from it. And they've seen this with the Irish in particular. They've seen this with other studies, like the No Irish Need Apply. And then going back, and my father, right? My grandfather came from Ireland. My father grew up in Queens. And he said, I remember as a boy, you could walk down the street and every store had that in there. No Irish Need Apply. So we're talking about New York City in the 1840s, 1850s. They've gone around and done studies, and they find that the number is like this in newspapers and trying to find evidence of this. So it ties into that. And that's a different type of question. So,
You look like
sorry.
You look
Yeah.
like you wanted to.
I was
Yeah.
going to mention the 1832 cholera
Yeah.
epidemic, which I think the number there was 6,000.
It was 6,000, yeah.
And so, there is a possibility of legitimate
Conflating.
historical conflation and messiness going on here that it's probably safe to say a substantial, if not a majority, were Irish of those cholera. I'm not sure about that. And maybe a substantial portion of them were involved with the canal, and so these threads might be not entirely invented, but they start to get a little blurry and messy.
Great, thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am.
The lady at the mic this past weekend played Margaret, the ghost
Yes,
of
I
Margaret.
was Margaret Howery.
Oh, she's one of my favorite people. I love Margaret.
Thank you, thank you.
Yes, sir. We're going to take just a couple more questions, and then you can have at us in a more informal basis.
My question's for Professor Campanella, but it's drawing on something Professor Kelley said. This observation that New Orleans becomes Americanized at the end of the 1800s when the binary black-white racial system is imposed on it, ill-fitting as that may be. You have censuses being taken in New Orleans since 1810. And my understanding is like mixed race, the first time you could check that was 2010. And even Hispanic, the first time you could check that was like the mid-1900s. But going back, the whole history of New Orleans has Hispanic people and mixed race people. And I'm wondering how you deal with census data with this black-white question, and who decides? Is it self-reporting? Is it the census taker?
It's a great question, and our census reinvents itself every 10 years, and in part because our nation reinvents itself constantly, right? And so the census is doing an honest-to-goodness job of trying to keep up with the nation, but this makes, if you're trying to do a time series analysis and do apples-to-apples comparisons, it wreaks havoc on that, and so it's part of the fun of doing empirical research. And I would note also, picking up on something Laura said, that we think of them, they were all Italians, they were all German, even though they don't. That's one of the dangers of doing empirical research, that all these complicated questions have to be boiled down to a number, and gross oversimplification comes when you quantify. But you get benefits from this. Look at all the numbers we've been playing out. So it was in the 2000 census for the first time when Americans could choose a wide range of combinations. And so what used to be a discrete list of 2, 3, 4 categories suddenly by 2000 grows to almost an infinite number. I wonder what censuses are going to look like, at the end of this century.
And was race always self-reported, or was the census taker like, Campanella sounds Hispanic to me, I'm going to...
No, they would report.
It was self-reported.
You would have an enumerator going to your door, knocking. Every census until 1950. In 1960, they changed to mail. So almost all of you got mail. It's only when there's no responses that they still knock on doors. But it was received information. It wasn't imposed. I guess in some cases it might have been imposed. But
I think to also add on to what Richard was saying, that we get back to that question of identity. That's part of what you're speaking to, and self-identify, and I think that is critical to understanding how do I see myself, and then you take that to the next question of what community do I belong to, and that's in part what we talk about when we talk about immigrants, and immigrants become ethnic groups, and do they see themselves a part of that? Do they identify, and then why do they? And so the race question is less about numbers than it is about laws and then communities redefining themselves too.
And there are other values that come into play. Up in Sinclair's The Jungle, when he's writing about the Polish immigrants in Chicago. Okay, in today's political climate, people are very conscious of, and in most respects, very proud of their ethnic heritage. Right? They want to claim it, they want to embrace it, and in some cases, they lament its loss. But a century ago, nobody wanted to be Polish or Lithuanian. I mean, they wanted to Americanize. And the literature is replete. And while these groups formed associations, especially the new immigrant groups like the one that founded this building, to kind of mutually define themselves and protect themselves, the overwhelming impulse was to be American back then, not necessarily because of the racial thing. I mean,
it's a lot more recent than 100 years. I myself grew up in a household that discouraged old world references.
Yeah. And adding on to that with the contemporary aspect to it is that the Irish, we've had this resurgence of the Irish in this city. So I spoke about ethnic identity, why is it maintained, and I've worked up to the 1930s. It's interesting that our first big St. Patrick's Day crew organizations in the 1940s, when so much is happening and changing in the Channel. But in the last 10, 15 years, we've seen a lot with Irish-born coming to this city. We've seen a resurgence in that, and so much so that 2 years ago, we had the formation of Irish Network New Orleans, which is over 500 members strong. So it gives you a sense of Irish-American coming together and working upon that idea. You only have to go to Finn McCool's in Mid-City to hear good Irish brogues, along with, of course, good New Orleanian brogues. And then it was just announced a couple of weeks ago with Paul Gleason, our Consul General of Ireland, that New Orleans was chosen to be the Famine commemoration city for 2014. And the Republic of Ireland chooses, it's funny on several levels, but it's also important. The Republic of Ireland chooses an international city that they think is important or to the Irish diaspora. And so this year was Sydney, it's been Boston, New York, Liverpool, and here we are following in New Orleans was chosen. And so it gives you a sense of not only how significant that Irish population was in the antebellum period, but also today, because it's the idea that they want to bridge the two, the connection that it's alive here in the city. And so I think that is significant, that we're not just talking about things in the past. And then, of course, it is slightly humorous because New Orleans is known for its food. And, what do you serve at a famine commemoration?
Okay. I think we have time for two more questions. We'll take two more questions and call it an evening. Yes, sir.
Yes, you mentioned Cuba twice, Spain, Mexico once. What was their impact?
We didn't mention Russia at all.
No. Sorry.
Okay.
What was the numbers, and why wouldn't it have been more if they were so close to us?
Well, I plotted those out. They're compared to those Irish and German. They're in the low hundreds. Maybe breaking 1,000. It's just throughout the Spanish-speaking Caribbean world. Mexico and Cuba would have been at the top of that list, but you see Venezuela, you see other ones. And they mostly, this is late antebellum, okay? And they mostly settled along with the other Catholic Mediterranean or Caribbean population, and that was in the Creole section. That was the Catholic area. That was presumably, now remember, this 1850s is also the Know Nothing movement. And so settling in an uptown area for those populations, I'm not saying they were completely excluded, but it's likely they would have felt somewhat unwelcome there and would have felt more at home in the lower French Quarter. The language as well, Southern European Romantic languages. You would have had a really rich mix in that lower quarter area of Spanish-speaking French-speaking. And on the note of Americanization, there's a number of ways to think of when that transformation occurs. And clearly it's an ongoing one. And I think most people here would argue that the Americanization is not complete here. And language is a major one of when French and French Creole starts to peter out. So.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
And one last question. Make it a good one. Whoops.
All right. It's
Two last questions. Two last questions.
Did you see that? Okay.
I'll be brief. It's for you, Michael Sartisky.
Yeah.
I've been missing Keith Weldon Medley all evening, and you talked about the triumph of the Bourbons in 1898. I wonder if you want to say something about Plessy Ferguson.
Keith Weldon Medley was supposed to join us this evening and had to beg off, and it's a shame because Keith has been tremendous on the subject, particularly on Plessy versus Ferguson, and I don't often feel inadequate, but trying to replace Keith on this subject, I do feel inadequate. The sidebar to kind of what we've been discussing, but again, this is the resurgence at the end of the 19th century of the free people of color, particularly those with Haitian origin, Desdunes, Rodolphe Desdunes in particular, was at the forefront of organizing a group again, in this period, there are no free people of color. I mean, that the status of that category was lost with emancipation during the Civil War. In fact, no group lost its social status and prestige worse than the free people of color following the Civil War, because their privileged status was now submerged within the general category of all emancipated slaves, of which they were not. But that group continued to be intellectually and politically disproportionately influential in trying to, among other things, combat the Jim Crow laws of that period. And Homer Plessy taking a seat. This was a planned event. This was not accidental. Him taking a seat on that train precisely in order to challenge the laws was the result of that repressed but never defeated resiliency in the face of that oppression of that period. Keith, forgive me, that's the best I can do.
Very good.
Somebody tell him I tried my best, please. Okay. Yes, sir. Your
last question.
Okay.
Yes, I have two questions. Excuse me. There's a comment that the Irish famine propelled a lot of immigrants into the U.S. in the 1840s and maybe the 50s. That's the first issue. How many other European countries had similar motivation to have their immigrants come here? Was famine more common in Europe, or was there a threat of no jobs, no income, and so on? In other words, what was the propelling force behind European immigration here at that same time in history? Second part of my question is this. How much do you think did American independence ideas, civil rights, freedom of the press, so on, feed back to Europe? In other words, how much did the new immigrant experiences here of that century influence European political evolution? And so I would like to take those two questions. Okay, thank you.
So I'll take the Irish, and I'll leave the rest of Europe for Richard.
You're going to take the Irish. You're going to take the Irish. What a surprise.
I'm going to take the Irish,
okay.
yes.
Okay.
So, you're correct in the sense, and Richard and I have spoken about it tonight, that you need a lot of push and pull factors. And this is true for any immigrant group. And so we look at what are the push factors. So, so for those of you who don't know, here's a great number for you. So we speak about how important the potato is to the Irish diet. What you may not realize is how important the potato was to the Irish diet. 60% of the Irish population relied upon the potato solely as their source of nourishment. And everybody, when you go out shopping for Thanksgiving, remember this fact. The average male ate 14 pounds of potato a day. The average female, yeah, and I've done extensive research on that. I couldn't believe it. Average female, 8 to 12, and children corresponding down. That's per day, every day. So when you get that 10 pound, add the 5 pound, and then look at it every day and say, I'm eating this, and tomorrow I'm eating this. So when you remove that food source, the impact is tremendous. And the other thing people don't know is that Ireland's still growing food. It's growing food, it's growing grain, it's exporting it. And so there is food in Ireland. And so, but that's a major pull. And the reason we don't see big immigration numbers in 1845, the first year of the potato blight, is because blight, famine, agricultural problems are common in any agricultural society. It's going to be a tough year. And then you get through the next one. But when it returns, and then 47 and Black 47, this is when immigration spikes because people have used all their other resources, and then it gets down to the big question of, it could come again. And to put this into our own frame of mind, we experienced Hurricane Katrina. Now, we know hurricanes are random. They happen this, they win the other. We can't control them. Same thing with like agricultural disasters in the 19th century. Imagine if Hurricane Katrina hit us a year later, and then the third year. How many of you would be here the fourth year or the fifth year? When do you start making other plans? And so that's what you do. And the Irish employed, as the Germans and many other groups, chain migration. That is, you send as many as your family as you can, and if it's only one, they come here, they make money, and then they bring over the next one. And to give you a sense of how important family and kinship is in Ireland, in a 10-year period in the United States, Irish immigrants sent back to Ireland $20 million. That's $20 million in 1840. I haven't converted it to today. So Ireland is the extreme of what's happening, but that's a major push. And that's like a kicking out, That's not a gentle reason to leave the country.
Richard, you want to
Yeah,
take a final comment?
I would very much agree that with the Irish, it was the leading, weightiest variable. But there were other groups where it was a very real, but it was one of many variables. Yep. And I would particularly point to the Germans. There was famines on the heels of the Napoleonic Wars that served as an impetus to move on. And in post-unification Sicily, that was also a reason to get out. I believe it might be the case as well in Russia that led to some of the exodus of that population. But one other major issue there that drove many Polish and Russian immigrants, almost all Orthodox Jews, to New York as well as New Orleans was anti-Semitic pogroms, which we haven't talked about. Regarding your second question, that's a very challenging question, and wouldn't it be great if we could answer that? If we would, to what extent did was the motivating factor to come over this, basically what we call now the American dream, and I have a sense that they've heard rumors of opportunity here, but with the notion of chain immigration, that the male bird of passage would come and test the waters, and if it worked out, family reunification would bring the rest of them. And so, immigrants are fundamentally pragmatists. And if it works, it works.
Yeah. Well, okay, I just wanted to add one thing with that. And certainly, again, speaking with Ireland, the American letter and that connection that goes back and forth. And as Richard just said, sending more of your family, which means more people in that village learn about it. But also, we haven't even talked about politics. So we've got religion, we've got politics, and certainly the fight in Ireland to be free of the British yoke, to become a republic, is something that Irish Americans stay very actively involved in, and they follow the news in Ireland. And so I think messages about what's happening here go back there. But when you see the way the Irish, from the formation of the ancient order of the Hibernians to the Fenians to, the GAA, all the different ways, up to the IRA, all the different ways that Irish Americans contributed financially and otherwise to what was going on in Ireland, and gives you an indication of how much they're using their position here to try to bring dreams home there.
Well, this is what we'll try to do. There is going to be a third panel picking up this narrative thread into the 20th century. I will say, in response to the gentleman, I was giving you guys the last word, but you went on a little ways, so I'm going to insert. Yeah, there are major precipitating push events. The Irish famine, certainly for the Irish, okay? The failed revolutions in 1848. So far as Louisiana's population goes, the Franco-Prussian War in 1870. Okay, a lot of young men fled conscription especially from Alsace, Lorraine. Ask John Besh why his family's here, and that was enormous. The pogroms that began to increase at the end of the 19th century. These are all forces on the United States, not necessarily specific to New Orleans. I think I can sense the group that we have had a remarkable immersion in a topic in ways that is very rarely discussed. And would you please join me in thanking these two extraordinary panelists.